During the darkest and most desperate years of the Second World War, when every nation was fighting not just for victory, but for survival itself, the world witnessed industrial miracles that seemed almost impossible. Europe was burning, Asia was collapsing under the strain of total war, and factories everywhere struggled to meet the demands of armies that consumed machines faster than they could be built. But across the Atlantic, inside the United States, something extraordinary was happening. Something so unbelievable, so mechanically impossible, that even German intelligence officers refused to believe the reports. They thought it was Allied propaganda, until they saw the truth with their own eyes. America was building a bomber made of more than 1.5 million parts, and it was rolling off an assembly line every 63 minutes. Not every week, not every day, every single hour. And the German spies watching this miracle unfold were stunned into silence, because nothing in Europe came even close. This was no ordinary factory. This was Willow Run, and this was Ford. To understand why this shocked German intelligence so deeply, you have to go back to the early years of the war, when aircraft production across the world was slow, expensive, and painstakingly manual. Bombers weren't cars. They weren't stamped out of steel sheets the way automobiles were. They required thousands of rivets placed by hand, precision alignment of wings and fuselage parts, wiring that had to be woven carefully by experts, and engines that needed days of assembly and testing. Most of Europe's factories were old, cramped, and not designed for mass production. Germany relied on skilled craftsmen, machinists, and engineers who worked with tight tolerances but slow methods. A bomber for the Luftwaffe could take weeks to complete. Even the Americans before the war struggled with aircraft production at scale. But everything changed when the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Washington understood something that Germany would later learn the hard way. The war would be won not just on the battlefield, but in the factories. Steel, oil, trucks, tanks, and planes. Whoever made more would eventually dominate, and no one in America was more prepared for industrial war than Henry Ford's empire. Ford had already proven decades earlier that he could reshape civilization through mass production. He reduced the time to build a car from 12 hours to 90 minutes. He lowered costs, boosted consistency, and trained ordinary workers to create machines that once required specialists. Now, the US government wanted him to perform that miracle again, but with bombers, not cars. Bombers like the B-24 Liberator, one of the most complex aircraft ever designed, with a massive wingspan, precision-built components, and more than 1 million individual parts that had to fit together perfectly. Experienced aircraft manufacturers said it couldn't be done. Some even laughed at the idea. You couldn't build a bomber like a car, they insisted. It was simply too complex. But Ford disagreed, and so began one of the greatest industrial experiments in human history. Ford engineers created the world's largest building under a single roof, stretching nearly a mile long. They installed assembly lines that moved aircraft across the floor just like automobiles. They used conveyors, overhead cranes, stamping machines, jigs, fixtures, and standardized tools to break the bomber into smaller, repeatable tasks. Workers who had never touched an airplane in their lives were trained to install part after part with mechanical precision. Instead of master craftsmen building a bomber from the inside out, Willow Run broke the aircraft into thousands of tiny steps that anyone could learn. At first, it was chaos. Nothing fit. The parts were misaligned. The production line stopped constantly. Engineers argued with supervisors. Car building techniques didn't naturally translate to aircraft manufacturing. The wings were too long, the fuselage too sensitive, the engines too delicate. But Ford didn't give up. They redesigned tools, perfected fixtures, created new training programs, and gradually transformed the chaos into something remarkable. A factory that didn't just build bombers, but mass-produced them. And as Willow Run began to stabilize, German intelligence started receiving reports that seemed absurd. Spies in South America, industrial observers in neutral countries, and Luftwaffe analysts studying photographs all encountered the same unbelievable claim. America was planning to build one B-24 bomber every hour. At first, German officers laughed. They believed it was an Allied psychological trick to intimidate the Axis. They shared reports sarcastically in Berlin offices, joking that even American capitalism couldn't bend the laws of physics. How could a bomber with over 1 million parts be assembled faster than German factories could assemble trucks? It seemed impossible. But the Germans underestimated one thing: the scale of American industry. The United States had vast natural resources, enormous factories, highly automated production lines, electric power that never shut off, and an engineering culture built on efficiency rather than tradition. German aircraft plants were often bombed, undersupplied, scattered, and forced to move underground. Skilled workers were drafted into the military. Tools wore out. Raw materials were scarce. Everything slowed production. Meanwhile, America mobilized millions of workers, men and women, into factories that ran 24 hours a day. Eventually, the truth became undeniable. A captured German report revealed genuine alarm. American industry was producing aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them, and at the center of this unstoppable wave was Willow Run. German spies managed to collect data through neutral countries, aerial reconnaissance, and industrial trade leaks. What they discovered stunned them completely. The assembly line at Willow Run was real. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder as a bomber slowly moved past them on rails. One group installed wiring, the next installed seats, the next fitted the bomb bay. Another team mounted the wings. Engine specialists dropped the massive power plants into place with cranes. Every worker learned a single motion, a single task, repeated with machine-like consistency. And then came the moment that shocked German intelligence the most. A fully functional, combat-ready bomber weighing over 30,000 pounds rolled out of the final assembly area every 63 minutes. Not a prototype, not a partial frame, a complete B-24 Liberator. This meant that while German factories struggled to repair bomb damage, America was creating more bombers in a single day than the Luftwaffe could replace in a week. German officers couldn't believe it. They studied the photos again and again. They checked the numbers repeatedly. They even conducted internal investigations to see if someone had made a mistake. But it was real. Ford had achieved something unprecedented. Willow Run became known as the Arsenal of Democracy, a symbol of American industrial power so overwhelming that it helped decide the fate of the war. By the peak of production, the factory produced more than 650 bombers per month. Thousands of aircraft left the plant, flown away by young pilots straight from the runway attached to the factory itself. It was a sight no enemy could match. German analysts reported with growing fear that this single factory had an output equivalent to several entire German aircraft plants combined, and the psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers on the front lines kept seeing more and more American aircraft filling the skies. Luftwaffe commanders realized that even if they shot down dozens, hundreds more would replace them. American air power became a tidal wave. The bombers dropped supplies, bombed factories, destroyed supply lines, and crippled Axis production deep inside Europe. Willow Run was not just a factory, it was a weapon. But behind this industrial miracle was something even more astonishing: the workers themselves. Teenagers, mechanics, farm workers, homemakers, immigrants, machinists, and thousands of women, many of whom had never worked a factory job before, became part of the greatest production effort in world history. They stood in long lines outside the plant, braving cold mornings, riding buses for hours, and sometimes working 16-hour shifts. Every worker knew that what they built could decide the outcome of the war, and the responsibility pushed them harder than any supervisor could. German intelligence couldn't understand how ordinary workers in America were building machines faster than trained experts in Germany. They failed to see the deeper reason. The US had embraced mass production like a religion. Everything was standardized, everything was measured, everything was tested, timed and optimized. Factories didn't just operate, they evolved. Every week, engineers redesigned tools, improved workflow, analyzed bottlenecks, and shortened steps in the process. The production line itself became a battlefield where efficiency was the weapon. And the result was an aircraft production miracle so overwhelming that even Germany's most elite spies could only watch in disbelief. As the war intensified and Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the truth about America's industrial might became clearer with every passing month. German officers who once mocked the idea of mass-produced aircraft now found themselves studying reports late into the night, trying to understand the scale of the threat they were facing. And at the center of every document, every analysis, every intelligence summary, one name appeared again and again: Willow Run. The Ford bomber plant had become a symbol of something the German High Command had never anticipated: an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could inflict them. By 1943, the skies above Europe had begun to shift. Where once the Luftwaffe dominated, now formations of American B-24s and B-17 stretched across the horizon like floating steel cities. Each bomber carried thousands of pounds of explosives, and each mission struck deeper into the German industrial heartland. Every time the Luftwaffe intercepted them, every time German anti-aircraft guns opened fire, every bomber that fell would be replaced almost instantly by another rolling off the line in Michigan. German fighter pilots could destroy 10 in one mission, but by the time they returned to base, Ford had already built more. This reality began to erode morale within the Luftwaffe. Pilots wrote home describing endless waves of American aircraft. Ground crews struggled to repair airfields and aircraft under constant bombardment. German factories, many of them scattered, small and relying on old machinery, couldn't keep up. Skilled labor was running out. Replacement parts were running out, and the raw materials were disappearing faster than they could be mined or imported. Meanwhile, Willow Run consumed mountains of aluminum, steel, copper, rubber, and fuel every day, as if the supplies were endless. German intelligence finally concluded the unthinkable. American production was not just larger, it was unstoppable. Reports described it as a machine that feeds itself, a self-sustaining engine of war powered by a civilian economy larger than the entire Axis combined. American women entered the workforce by the millions. Migrants moved across the country seeking jobs. Entire towns were built around the factories, with schools, homes, and hospitals rising almost overnight. Industry, agriculture, transportation, energy, everything shifted into high gear. It was total mobilization, unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the German spies, who finally witnessed Willow Run in person, sent back reports that shocked even the most experienced intelligence officers. They described a factory so big that walking from one end to the other took half an hour. They reported assembly lines moving under bright lights at all hours. They reported the thunder of machines shaping metal, the hiss of welding torches, the roar of engines being tested. They wrote about workers who barely paused, engineers who monitored every detail, and foremen who communicated with radios and clipboards like battlefield commanders. One spy described it as an industrial battlefield, where the soldiers wore overalls instead of uniforms. The most stunning discovery was the timing. A B-24 Liberator emerged every 63 minutes. Exactly 63. German engineers refused to believe it. They demanded photographic proof. They questioned the measurements. But the math was real and terrifying. If the Americans kept this pace, they would produce thousands of bombers every year, enough to overwhelm every German defense, no matter how skilled or determined. And that is exactly what happened. As American bombers swarmed over the Reich, German production collapsed. Synthetic fuel plants were destroyed. Rail lines were severed. Ammunition depots exploded. Ball-bearing factories, engine plants, aircraft assembly sites. They were all slowly being crushed under the weight of American air power. The B-24 became the backbone of the strategic bombing campaign. It attacked oil fields, submarine pens, shipyards, steel mills, chemical plants, transportation hubs, and troop formations. And every time one was shot down, Willow Run simply built another. By late 1944, Germany was fighting a war of attrition it could never win. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements. Factories operated at a fraction of their capacity. Civilians lived under the constant threat of air raids. Food and fuel were rationed. Cities lay in ruins. And still, the bombers came. But the story of Willow Run isn't just about machines. It's about the people behind them. The workers who built the B-24s faced freezing winters, sweltering summers, exhaustion, and endless pressure. Some had never held a wrench before. Others left farms, offices, or classrooms to join the war effort. Many were women taking on heavy industrial jobs for the first time. They were motivated not by pay, but by purpose. They pinned newspaper clippings of soldiers to their lockers. Some wrote messages on the inside of bomber panels. "Good luck, boys. Bring this bird home." From the hands of Detroit to the skies of Europe. Pilots who later flew these bombers often talked about imagining the workers who built their aircraft, the people whose hands had tightened every bolt. They trusted them with their lives, and for the most part, that trust was rewarded. The B-24 became one of the most widely used bombers in the war, serving not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific, Africa, and the Mediterranean. It ferried supplies, hunted submarines, dropped bombs, rescued downed pilots, and supported frontline troops across multiple continents. Meanwhile, German intelligence continued to underestimate the situation. Reports sent to Berlin suggested that America was producing bombers at a pace beyond any industrial logic. Some analysts even believed the U.S. was exaggerating. But by the end of the war, the true numbers were undeniable. Ford's Willow Run plant alone built nearly 9,000 B-24 bombers, and the rest of the American aircraft industry produced tens of thousands more. To put that into perspective, Germany's entire aircraft production across dozens of factories struggled to keep up with a single American assembly line. The industrial imbalance was catastrophic. German generals later admitted that once American air power reached full strength, the war was effectively lost. But there was another layer to the story, one rarely told: the reaction of the German spies themselves. Many of them, after the war, confessed their disbelief at what they saw. They admitted that they had no idea a factory like Willow Run could even exist. One described it as a glimpse into a future Germany would never reach. Another wrote that he felt as if watching an avalanche forming on the horizon. They knew Germany could never match it. They could never replicate it. It was too big, too fast, too modern, too efficient. This realization created panic within the German leadership. They began rushing desperate, unrealistic plans to increase production. They moved factories underground, forced prisoners to work brutal hours, and demanded miracle weapons that engineers had no time or resources to build. But none of it mattered. American industry, supported by stable food supplies, uninterrupted electricity, abundant raw materials, and a secure homeland untouched by bombing, was too powerful. The psychological impact of Willow Run even reached Adolf Hitler himself. Reports indicate that he was furious when he learned of America's production levels. He believed it violated the natural limits of manufacturing. He believed it was physically impossible for a bomber to be built on an assembly line like a car, and yet the proof continued falling from the sky, bomb after bomb after bomb. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Cities burned, armies retreated. The The Luftwaffe was nearly gone. And still, Willow Run kept working. The bombers rolled out. American pilots flew them overseas, and the skies over Europe turned into a symbol of industrial dominance that no enemy could resist. When the war finally ended, the world tried to make sense of what had happened. How did a single nation produce more planes, tanks, ships, trucks, and weapons than the Axis combined? How did the Ford Motor Company build a 1.5 million part bomber every 63 minutes? How did German spies fail to understand what they were witnessing? The answer became clear in the years that followed. The war was not just won by bravery or tactics or strategy. It was won by factories. It was won by the workers who never picked up a rifle, but who fought their own battle on the assembly line. Willow Run became a symbol of the idea that industrial power could shape the world as much as armies could. After the war, the factory was eventually closed. The lights were switched off. The assembly line went silent. But its legacy lived on. Veterans who flew the B-24s kept photos of the factory. Workers told their children and grandchildren about the time they helped build the planes that defeated the Axis. Historians called it one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. And the German spies who once stood on neutral ground, staring in disbelief at the endless line of bombers rolling out of Willow Run. They left behind reports that now read like confessions of shock, fear, and grudging admiration. They realized too late that America's industrial strength was not a myth, not propaganda, not exaggeration. It was real, it was enormous, and it was unstoppable. In the end, the Ford plant at Willow Run didn't just build bombers. It built victory. It built hope. It built the foundation of a world where industrial power and human determination could turn the tide of history. And for those who witnessed it, friend or foe, it was a sight they would never forget.